Hello, welcome to episode 104 of the CRICKETher Weekly. Obviously, the big news this week has all revolved around the World Cup, and we're going to come on and talk about that.
Day 104 of the World Cup as well, isn't it?
We're going to talk about the World Cup in a minute, but yeah, of course, it feels like it's been going on for a while because it's kind of match upon match upon match. And for us, it's all happening overnight, which gives it a slightly stranger feel. So yeah, we'll come to that in a minute. But first of all, we should talk about another big piece of news that's come in this week, a little bit close to home, over in Ireland. So Cricket Ireland have awarded its first ever professional contracts to some members of the women's team. So there's going to be 7 international contracts. Those are the ones that they're billing as full-time professional contracts, and then 9 additional part-time education contracts that are going to be given basically generally to university students or maybe those who are just finishing up school. And the idea behind those is that they'll be full-time during the school holidays, and having that bit of money coming in will prevent them having to work during the school holidays. And of course, in addition to that, there's generally been an uptick in the investment, so that means that some of the coaching and support staff are also going to be able to come on board full time. So it's a bit of a revolution in women's cricket in India, wouldn't you say, Sid? It's quite significant.
In Ireland, not India. But yeah, I think this was obviously, this was something they really had to do once they gained a place in the ICC Championship. Obviously, that meant that they were going to need to spend a substantial amount of the next 3 years touring, and having teams over in order to fulfil their championship commitments. So they really needed a pile of full-time players. They haven't quite gone with a full-time option. We understand more people were offered full-time contracts, but decided to go with a part-time option for their own reasons, either because they're still studying or because they wanted to still keep doing their day jobs or whatever, in order to keep on with that, because obviously the situation for the Irish girls is that longer term they do have to keep far more of an eye on what they're doing longer term in terms of like their careers and things, and building careers for their kind of post cricket, because they're not obviously earning as much as the England or the Australian girls are, but it's a great step forward, and it's brilliant news coming out of Ireland, and hopefully that the girls in Ireland can use this as a springboard to be able to kind of cement their place in the championship and to cement the role of women's cricket there. So I was kind of I was really worried for women's cricket in Ireland when it looked like they might not make that place in the championship, and I thought that the place in the championship was going to be really important in terms of keeping players within the game and giving impetus to cricket in Ireland. And I think now they've got there, hopefully they can use that as a springboard to go forward and maintain that place going forwards.
Absolutely. Do we know how much the contracts are worth? Have we got any idea about that?
We don't know how much they're worth, but I think that we can take it as read that they're earning substantially less than the England or the Australian girls. So they're the Porsche dealers of Dublin are going to be untroubled by Laura Delaney in the next few months, I suspect.
Okay, so it's a significant step forward, but I suppose more to do if the ultimate position is to get them into a situation where the entire squad is fully professional.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on then to the World Cup. There's been. Sorry, were you going to say something?
No. We were going to move into the World Cup. What has been happening in the World Cup? It's been a bit odd, hasn't it? Because it's all starting to bleed into one a little bit. But are there any surprises this week? Remind us what's been going on, Raf.
Okay, well, I'm not going to give you a total rundown of every single match because that would be a little bit dull. But in terms of the headline kind of potential like upsets / near upsets, one of the big ones this week was obviously the Pakistan v South Africa match, where it really was edge of the seat, nail-biting stuff. In terms of there potentially being an upset on the cards, it would have been Pakistan's first ever win against South Africa in a World Cup. South Africa made 223 for 9, so a bit under par there, you'd have to say. And Pakistan got really close. Umaima Sohail and Nida Dar both made 50s, but Pakistan were eventually all out for 217. So they fell just short, just a few runs short. Yeah. And really interestingly, actually, because we don't see this very often, a bowler was player of the match. So it was obviously felt that Shabnam Ismail, her contribution was the defining one for South Africa, and that she really turned that match on its head when it looked like Pakistan were going to chase those runs down.
I think what's for me, what's important about that game is the fact actually that South Africa came through it. They had a scare, but they were professional enough and they had just enough depth to grind it out. And it's that old thing of the best teams are the ones that win even when they're not playing very, very well. South Africa have had a couple of rough games, but they're a better side than they've looked so far. Who are they playing next, Raf?
England.
We might come back to that in a minute then.
Yeah, let's come back to that. Let's save that one to the end because that's obviously coming up later today or wee hours of tomorrow morning from where we are in the world. Talking of England, though, the big upset this week really was that West Indies win against England. West Indies managed to get to 225 for 6, and actually, interestingly, it was two of their kind of non-big names who kind of dragged them to that total: Shemaine Campbell and Chedian Nation. And England had a couple of good stages in the chase, or a couple of good phases in the chase where they looked like they were going to chase them down. In particular, that ninth wicket partnership between Kate Cross and Sophie Eccleston, but eventually were all out for 218. So yeah, that was a bit of a turn up, wasn't it, Sid? That was it was a hard one to write because it kept kind of twisting and turning, I have to say.
Yeah, and that's not what England wanted at the end of the day. I mean, I think that the result against Australia was banked in, but it was always going to be a bit of a struggle. And this was in a way, this is what we've talked about. This is the game they really couldn't afford to lose because this, in theory, was one of the easier games they were going to face. And it has to be said that West Indies. Now we should praise West Indies. We did last week for their victory against New Zealand. Played well in that game. Hallie Matthews looked really good. As you say, a couple of different players came through this time, but that's always a positive when some different players do. And some. I mean, Chedian Nation's a bit of a veteran now. She's about 95 years old, isn't she?
Harsh.
No, but she's been around for a long while. Yeah. But she put all of her experience into that, and kind of made England pay. And but nevertheless, England really should have chased 225, shouldn't they, Raf?
Yeah, I said at the halfway point, which was the point at which I started writing up that England were going to win. I said if they don't chase these runs down easily, then they don't deserve to win the World Cup. And I'm afraid that that's an opinion that I still hold, because there weren't demons in that wicket. I don't think it looked to be relatively easygoing if you could just kind of concentrate a bit. And England just got nervous, didn't they? There's some really poor batting.
Yeah, I mean, it was disappointing all round. So I don't think it was a great bowling performance. I think that we're back with this thing of the fact that England are really struggling to take wickets, so that the lead seamers have hardly taken any wickets in the competition so far, and failure to take wickets meant that they made inroads into West Indies, but they let their late middle order get back into it, which they probably shouldn't have done, and the bowling attack is just generally looking a bit tired and a bit samey, and it's not just even that we've got 3 right arm seamers plus an all rounder that's also a right arm seamer. It's the fact that Anya Shrubsole is obviously she's getting a lot of swing out there and she's making use of the conditions, but the trouble is that every ball is swinging exactly the same way, and even a slower delivery is swinging exactly the same way, and there's just no variety to it, and everyone knows what to expect now from that, and so she's struggling to change it up. It means that she's very predictable and the batters know exactly what to expect, and that's to be expected in terms of there's so much better coaching now in the women's game. For many years, I mean, certainly even at 5 years ago, the level of analytics that people had access to, the level of TV footage people had access to, weren't what it is now. Nowadays, everybody in that competition knows exactly what to expect from Anya Shrubsole, and if she is delivering basically the same ball every time, it's going to be easier for them to play out, and unfortunately, that's what we're seeing.
Talking of better coaching, though, from a West Indies perspective, under Courtney Walsh, they really seem to have had this uptick. And actually, there was a really interesting piece that we tweeted about that Hypercourse wrote, all about that kind of period since he was appointed in October 2020, which was just after they had that really disastrous series against England, played in bubble conditions at Derby during the pandemic. And they lost all 5 of the T20s, and most of them they lost really badly. And they just looked like a side that was totally in the doldrums. And it just goes to show what kind of almost like a talismanic coach can do for a side, I suppose. So obviously I remember kind of growing up watching Courtney Walsh in his playing days, and you'd think that he'd be somebody who could really bring on the fast bowlers. But I was just struck by Hypercourse piece finished with a quote from Stephanie Taylor talking about the new coaching setup, and she says they've been able to teach us things we were completely unaware of previously. It makes you wonder what sort of players we could be if we'd learned some of these things sooner. What sort of player would I be if I knew at the age of 7 or 8 what I know now? And that's a really striking quote, because it really does speak to this, the importance of putting in place some of these coaching structures. And, it almost relates to what we were talking about earlier with Ireland, of actually having a full-time coaching setup. And that's one of the really important things that professionalisation has brought to countries like England and Australia.
Yeah, and it's the thing about coaching is kind of understanding where the gaps are and understanding your players and teaching them those new things. That's the kind of thing that Mark Robinson was very good at. Mark Robinson himself, it was never a great player at all. I mean, he was a reasonable county bowler, and by all accounts, not a great batsman. But
you said it.
he was very good at understanding the players and finding ways to talk to them and finding ways to educate them. Trevor Griffin, same, has got the same skills, and it really sounds like Courtney Walsh has also got those skills of being able to relate to the players and find ways to bring the best out of them. So that's great.
Yeah, and I guess partly in the World Cup it's about the expectations. So the expectations around West Indies were potentially that they would win their matches maybe against Pakistan and Bangladesh, and that would be it. And actually they've already exceeded those expectations, and Courtney Walsh should be really proud of his team for doing that.
Absolutely.
To kind of flip to the opposite end of the spectrum, Australia. What can we say about Australia, Sid? Their dominance continues. Most recently, the last match that was played before we recorded this, their match against New Zealand, which has obviously been given a lot of hype, particularly after New Zealand beat them by, I think it was 9 wickets in that warm-up.
Yeah, New Zealand smashed them in the warm-up, but don't read too much into warm-ups, I think is the lesson here.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was a big win in the end, 141 runs. Australia only made 269. I say only because we've seen 300 plus scores in this World Cup, and we've seen Australia do that. So 269 for 8.
Well, they looked to be heading for even less at one point, but again they had a huge finish.
Yeah.
So against England they had a huge finish. Rachel Haynes put on a pile of runs in the end. Ash Gardner led the charge this time and put on a huge pile. Ash Gardner was like one ball away. She needed one more ball basically to score the fastest international 50 of all time. Yeah. If she'd hit that ball, one more ball she needed for 2, it would have been the fastest international 50 of all time. And so they just smashed it at the end. And if you're going to score like 100 runs off the last 10 overs, then that makes an absolutely massive difference to what the other team have to come out and face. Not just because they're facing another 100 runs where they thought they might be facing 60 runs less, but because they've just been well and truly walloped. And how does that make you feel psychologically when you think it's going okay? Oh damn, we've just conceded 100 runs in 10 overs.
I think Ash Gardner got a bit bored in her COVID isolation. She's like, right, I'm going to come out there and I'm going to absolutely smash it. And she totally did. So good on her. And then obviously New Zealand were bowled out for 128 in the end, which is actually a bit miserable really, because we would have preferred to have seen them really try and go after those runs.
Yeah, and that's severely damaged their net run rate as well. And they've now lost 2 games, so they look like they're definitely going to be in a net run rate scrap. Shall we talk about where the teams actually are in terms of this qualification thing? So it was actually good news for England, because England's qualification route is now back in their own hands, because New Zealand have kind of swapped places with them. So up until last night, England needed other results to go their way. There wasn't a huge amount of other results, but there were a small number of scenarios where England could win all of their remaining games and still not qualify. That's kind of turned slightly on its head. So it's now New Zealand are in that boat. New Zealand can win all their remaining games and they still might not qualify. England now, if they win all their remaining games, they will qualify. But it's still very much open. Everybody could still win the group. In theory, everybody, even Australia, could still come last. Australia lose all their remaining games, they could still finish bottom of the table.
Yeah, by some crazy miracle, the entire squad comes down with COVID or something. Anyway, but
they have to send in Matthew Mott in a dress to...
It's actually quite remarkable thinking about it, that we've got to this stage in the World Cup with only one player, as far as we know, coming down with COVID.
Yeah, well, let's hope it stays that way.
Absolutely, yeah. I shouldn't count my chickens before they've hatched, should I? Because we're getting to the real kind of the point of the group stages, aren't we? The pointy end.
Well, yeah. I mean, England's match tonight. It's not quite a must-win, Raf.
No.
England could lose this game and still qualify, but the number of scenarios where they do starts to go down rapidly. So if they lose tonight, it's sort of 50-50. About half the scenarios where they win the remaining games, they get through, and about half of them they don't. Okay. So they really are in quite a lot of trouble if they don't win this game tonight. And South Africa, we said that they've scraped through a couple of games, but they're due a performance. If I was England, I would not particularly be looking forward to this. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's really tough. As you say, because of the couple of bad results that they've had so far, they've really backed themselves into a corner, England have. And I think the other way that they've backed themselves into a corner, to some extent, is actually with their squad selections. So if we think about kind of the changes that England might make to their playing 11 ahead of the match against South Africa, it's actually quite tricky to think about things they could do. So obviously we were talking about this actually last night over dinner, as we do, because we just don't have any other conversations that don't revolve around women's cricket. That's not quite true. But anyway, yeah, so what changes could England make? Well, if you look at kind of a couple of the batters who aren't performing, suppose that you could make an argument for dropping Amy Jones, who has been short of form recently. You'd obviously then have to have Tammy Beaumont take the gloves, but who have you got to kind of come in then and replace her? We've got Emma Lamb. Well, and that's basically the only kind of spare batter that they've got in the squad.
That's really the only batting option, yeah.
And obviously, Emma Lamb isn't in great shape of form herself, and then you have the massive negative knock-on impact, which is that you don't have basically the best wicket-keeper in the women's game keeping wicket for you. So that's a tough one to argue for.
Yeah, I think it's really unlikely they're going to drop Amy Jones. Lauren Winfield might be a little bit more concerned. I mean, we'll see. We thought that she should be concerned, a couple of games ago, and it turned out they've decided to stick with her. I don't know. I mean, would you move Emma Lamb up to the top of the order? I mean, I think that's what I would want to see. I want to see if we're going to see Emma Lamb in the 11, maybe you want to bring her up to the top of the order and give her in her natural position, or do you bring Danny Wyatt up to the top and put Emma Lamb in at 6, Raf? What would you do?
I think it's definitely an option, isn't it, to bring Danny Wyatt up the order? And one of the points in her favour is that she really wants to be opening for England. Yes, she's been to some extent still pigeonholed as a T20 player, as a T20 specialist. But if you ask Danny Wyatt, she wants to be opening the batting for England in ODI. She doesn't want to be batting at 6 or 7. So she'd be really keen and kind of really have a point to prove. So that's potentially something you could do. And then maybe bring in Emma Lamb in that kind of number 7 spot perhaps. But it's really, as you kind of said earlier, it's perhaps also more about the bowling where England have struggled so far in the World Cup. And again, it's kind of, it's what do they do? And one of the dilemmas is going to be around Catherine Brunt, I suspect, because obviously what England were hoping was that they could come out and start the tournament strongly, because it's quite difficult to see them playing Catherine Brunt in every single one of these group stage matches because they're happening so thick and fast, and they'll want her to be properly fit and raring to go for the semi-final and the final should they get that far, which definitely does feel like counting my chickens.
Yeah, it's a dilemma now, isn't it? Do you play her because otherwise you might not reach the semi-final, or do you rest her in the expectation that you will reach that semi-final? We've talked already briefly about the fact that they've got 3 right arm seam options plus an all-rounder that's a right arm seam option. There obviously are options that they can bring in. One of them, Freya Davis, is another right arm seamer, but will potentially bring a different kind of, a bit more controlled approach. There's Tash Farron, who will bring in the left arm, but with less control. I think that's a fair thing to say. Do we bring in the other spinner? And England obviously felt their lack of options the other day because Heather Knight bowled herself for 7 overs, despite the fact she was clearly looking physically very uncomfortable. She obviously didn't want to be bowling, but she obviously felt she had no choice. So England are short of options. And this is the long batting lineup. There's advantages. It's a longer batting lineup, but it also gives you a shorter bowling lineup. And as we were discussing last night, they don't have the kind of the all-rounders that the Australians have got. They don't they don't have someone else that they can bring in that like a Sutherland that even when Ash Gardner wasn't there, they could bring in Sutherland, which would give you some batting and some bowling, because England seem to want their all-rounders to be kind of someone that you could select 100% for batting or 100% for bowling, and they won't accept, someone like a Sutherland where you go, well, she's probably not in the best 11 as a bowler, she's probably not in the best 11 as a batter, but overall we think that she can be a valuable part of their team. And Meg Lanning's had 7 bowling options that she could turn to, whereas England have had 5 and a bit with Heather herself.
Yeah, and I think that actually, if you look at England's squad, we've really only got one player who you would consider to be a genuine all-rounder, and that's Nat Siver. And beyond that, it's really difficult. And I do think that England over the last few years have got into this slight habit of kind of pushing people in the direction of being one or the other. And that means that your kind of net sessions, for example, are organised around that. So the bowlers don't get a decent batting session in the nets, for example. That's what we've observed, having kind of been to various net sessions over the years. Another kind of example would be Danny Wyatt, who originally was in the team very much as a bowler. She was in the team for her off-spinning bowling, and then since she's kind of emerged as this rather explosive, successful T20 batter, they've gone, okay, well, you don't need to bowl anymore, so don't bother working on your bowling. If you talk to her,
totally abandoned.
Yeah, if you talk to her, she'll say, actually, I'd quite like to turn my arm over for England occasionally. She still does it for the Vipers sometimes. Or whichever team she happens to be playing for, but she in domestic cricket. But at England level, they've just gone no, and they've to some extent they've done that a little bit with some of the other spin bowlers, kind of the opposite way around. So Sarah Glenn, for example, was originally they were sort of going, oh yeah, she's going to be really good with the bat. Never gave her an option to do that. Never gave her a position in the order to where she could show what she could do with the bat. And Charlie Dean, originally kind of we all thought of her as a batting all-rounder who bowled a bit, but Heather Knight kind of brought her into the squad last summer as somebody who could bowl a few overs and not really going to get much of a chance with the bat because she's kind of carded to come in at number 8, and it's really strange.
Is there longer term, so that's something that the longer term England really need to try and use. But
it's another way in which they've backed themselves into a corner ahead of this World Cup is they haven't got anyone in the off-spinning all-rounder position who can do exactly what Ash Gardner did against New Zealand a few hours ago.
Yep. So what do you think? Prediction now, Raf?
What, as in, are England going to beat South Africa?
Are England going to beat South Africa?
I don't know. I mean, I suppose we have to say yes, but it's like I said earlier in this episode. After that performance against West Indies, I'm just not convinced that England are playing in a way that means that they deserve to get to the semi-finals.
I think South Africa are going to come back hard tonight, and I think that they'll give England a very tough game. I suspect South Africa will win tonight.
Okay, well,
and on that bombshell.
Yeah, shall I drop the mic?
No,
I won't actually drop it, because it'll break it. Anyway, thanks for tuning in, as ever. Really excited about the next week of this World Cup, and we'll see you this time next week. Bye for now.
Bye.